Hello YouTube, this is Remarkable Republican bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, and today I would like to explore the issue of gay morality, and I would like to do so through what I think is a useful vehicle of thought. So, as you all know, the Supreme Court recently ruled that homosexual marriage will become legal in America, and at first I thought that this would mean, certainly opening the gates of depravity even further. However, upon mature reflection, I think that there have always been homosexuals in American public life, and some of them have made great contributions. And today I would like to give you one example of someone who did just that. Robert E. Lee. In the 19th century, people did not identify as homosexual even when they were attracted to men. This is because it would be socially unacceptable and nobody would really fully understand what it would mean. However, we have to imagine that there were plenty of homosexuals back then, just like there are now. The assless chaps weren't there for them to show off pride, but certainly there were men around to have sex with. Now, the evidence for Lee's homosexuality is circumstantial, however, it is also undeniable. He was at West Point for 4 years as a young gentleman and the son of a Revolutionary War hero, Light Horse Harry Lee. And he received no demerits in that time. Most demerits would be given for going out and having sex with women. So Lee was apparently not really interested in that. Like his father, normally and people inherit their lasciviousness from their fathers, he has no known mistresses, whereas his father was a man of many women. Lee's wife became arthritic at a young age after just a few years of marriage, and we have to assume that his marriage was sexless. Yet, so far as we know, there were no mistresses ever. Odd, to say the least. In 1855 to 1859, he lived on the frontier in Texas where there were almost no women around, and we have no known incidents of female contact. For him to have done that would have required him to have sex with somebody's wife, which would obviously raise a scandal, and we have no incident of scandal during that time period. Lee was known as a notorious flirt, but that is often a sign of covering up, or it's sort of a playful code between gay guys and straight women. Lee was short-tempered and impulsive at times, which is a symptom of homosexuality. And during his retirement years from 1865 to 1870 at Washington and Lee University, he spent his time around young men and also had no relationships with women other than one of his daughters who lived with him. For those of you who are familiar with Lee's military career, you know that he first came to prominence for his role as Winfield Scott's adjutant in Mexico. However, what is of note here is that he was Winfield Scott's golden boy. Winfield Scott had a staff full of all kinds of West Point men, a lot of really top-notch guys who would go on to prove their mettle in the Civil War, but he selected Robert E. Lee to fulfill every major mission. Lee was Scott's golden boy. Later, Scott would offer Lee command of the Union Army, and he would say that Lee was the finest soldier he'd ever served with. It seems that perhaps Scott had a pederastic interest in Lee. Whether it was reciprocated or not is hard to say, but Lee did succeed in getting assignments. While he was in Mexico, Lee took on no mistresses, which is a little odd because most soldiers, even Stonewall Jackson, did. And not only are there some really hot, Mexican women, but there would be no real chance of that getting back to Lee's wife in Virginia, so there was literally no risk. But yet he abstained from doing so, which is pretty suspicious. Lee was often on patrol with only one or two other men, including P.G.T. Beauregard, who we'll talk about momentarily. Perhaps the oddest associate of Robert E. Lee was P.G.T. Beauregard, one of the Civil War's leading generals, and one of the top 4 or so Confederate generals. I think he was one of the few men who held the rank of full general. And he was known for having done homosexual deeds at various times during his life. However, most of his sexual deeds were with women, and they were many. He served with and under Lee while they were in Mexico. Lee would often be accompanied just by Beauregard and given we know that Lee was indifferent to women and Beauregard was insatiable towards both sexes, we can only assume that things happened at least once or 10 times. Lee often advocated for Beauregard during the Civil War, even though Beauregard had many enemies and it was not a popular position to take. Further, the positions that Lee often asked that Beauregard get would have been in the West, so it wouldn't have affected Lee at all. So he took an unusual interest in Beauregard's career, despite having no personal stake in it. As I said before, Beauregard is a notoriously promiscuous bisexual, and that was a lifelong thing for him, even up until his death in 1893. Now, Beauregard's career was held back by hysterics, one of the hallmarks of homosexual behavior, and the affairs that he had with the wives, sons, and daughters of prominent Confederates really held back his career, including his attempted seduction of Jefferson Davis's wife. Lee's fondness for his lieutenant Stonewall Jackson is legendary, and what a lot of people overlook is that Stonewall Jackson was not qualified by dint of his seniority or his social status to rise as high as he did. However, there seems to have been a personal reason that Lee promoted him. Stonewall and Lee had a lot of things in common. Both were heroes in Mexico. Stonewall was in the artillery. He was very religious, just like Lee. He was a Virginian, just like Lee. And he possessed a certain eccentric charisma, just like Lee. There were no known sexual encounters between the two men, but we can't really discount the fact that Lee almost certainly had a crush on Jackson that played a role in his promotion of Jackson's career and his elevation to Corps Command. Lee grieved excessively at Stonewall's death, and he never got over him, even to the point of making it really weird for other subordinates. One of the most talked about relationships of the Civil War is the relationship between Lee and Joseph E. Johnston. There's a ton of reading on this, so you can look it up for yourself. I'm only going to highlight the important stuff. There was, even though both men were friends, there was a lot of tension in their relationship before, during, and after the war, and neither one of them ever wrote why that was, and it seems to mostly be Johnston being bitter towards Lee. Johnston was a wannabe playboy. He did his best, but he never really developed Lee's legend because he just wasn't nearly as successful as a general. So when you're a successful general, just like being a successful athlete or anything else, it really helps you get women. And Johnston definitely had that interest, whereas Lee could have any woman he wanted, but of course he never took advantage of that. And it seems like Johnston was very jealous of that. Further, junior officers tended to gravitate more towards Lee than they did towards Johnston. So, Johnston wanted that camaraderie, whereas Lee, wanted other things. And as a non-gay, Johnston just wasn't quite as good at Lee at stroking male egos to produce loyalty. And that harmed his career and made him less indispensable than Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is one of the great captains in Western history, and he is almost certainly the greatest general that America has ever produced. However, his conduct at Gettysburg was not equal to his reputation or his brilliance. Why was Lee so off his game at Gettysburg? Well, for one, he was still grieving for Stonewall Jackson. That's well known. I don't think anybody would dispute that. However, we pretty much know that George Meade, the snapping turtle, was a homosexual. His mannerisms were very effeminate, and he was very, he had a lot of characteristics that one would associate with being gay, extremely awkward, etc. The correspondence between the two men had sort of a flirtatious tone to it that has made a lot of people uncomfortable, or at least it did until more recent times when people, aren't really that bothered by people being gay. So there's also the evidence that Meade had an opportunity after Gettysburg to crush Lee while he was trying to withdraw from Virginia, in the aftermath of the battle, but Meade held back his pursuit for reasons unknown. And Grant was appointed commander-in-chief, and he decided to oversee Meade, who was a good general but seemed unwilling to fight Lee. Why? They may have been lovers. Generally speaking, most homosexuals in America today are angry, loud, annoying people who advocate socialism. But they don't have to be. They have a choice. Look at Robert E. Lee. He could have just simply relegated himself to having sex with men 24 hours a day in some sort of endless orgy, but instead he tried to lead a country to freedom against federal tyranny. He lost, but he almost succeeded against nearly impossible odds. Had anyone else commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, the war would have ended in 1862. The other example, who I've already talked about in another video, is G-Man, who runs Preaching to the Choir Ministries, and he fights against the homosexual agenda, even though he himself is clearly a homosexual. Now, I think that we should be optimistic about the future. Let's not assume that all gays will become Michael Moore. Let's assume that more of them will become like Robert E. Lee, and that they will actually make solid contributions to society. There's nothing preventing them. And now that they have equal rights, they also have no excuse anymore. So, ball's in your court, gays.